Good day. Yesterday, I discussed the information that was pouring out of various channels about significant advances by the Russians in and around Bakhmut, this city, this town in Donetsk region, which has been the focus of much of the fighting in Ukraine, or what was Ukraine, over the previous 4 months. And there's been more reports this morning of further Russian advances. There's been reports, for example, that a place called Kurdyumivka, another settlement in this area, has also now been captured by the Russians. And there's some reports as well that the position of the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut is now becoming extremely precarious. And I even saw one report, which, by the way, I consider to be less than reliable, that the major Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut have been withdrawn, and that the only units left there are territorial defense troops, in other words, reservists who have been called up to duty at short notice. I want to stress that I don't place much or indeed any credence in that last report, but I merely mention it as a sign of the sort of general mood that you find on both sides about the fighting in Bakhmut. The Russians increasingly confident, the Ukrainians increasingly despondent. Now, I received a private email from one correspondent, who, by the way, is not either Russian or Ukrainian, but it does, I think, accurately capture the mood amongst the Russians, and I'll just read it because it sums up the position, I think, quite well. This is, let me stress again, it's not necessarily a fully accurate reflection of the complete military situation, but as I said, it is an accurate reflection of the mood amongst the Russians at the present time. And it puts it like this: the Russian armed forces are making their biggest advance in months in the Donbass, registering significant territorial gains and laying the foundations for a major Ukrainian defeat in the Donbass. Within 24 hours, Russian and allied forces captured the town of Spornoye. Now that, by the way, I can't confirm. Spornoye was at one point captured by the Russians, then the Ukrainians managed to take it back. There's been much intense fighting. The last report I heard is that the Russians had re-entered Spornoye, but I haven't heard that they have actually fully recaptured it. But anyway, this report suggests that they have done. Within 24 hours, Russian and allied forces captured the town of Spornoye and the settlements of Andreevka, Ozaryanovka, Zelenopolye, and while the settlement of Kurdyumivka also fell. And indeed, as I said this morning, confirmation that Kurdyumivka is fully under Russian control, or to be precise, control of the Wagner group came, and that, it seems, is now irrefutable. And then we got a further report. This is, again, from this email: Ukrainian forces withdrew from the southern suburbs of Bakhmut as a result of the Russian advance. Now, I believe that the last is true. There have been a number of reports for some time that there's been street fighting in this area of Bakhmut, and I do get the sense that the Ukrainians have indeed pulled back from the southern suburbs of Bakhmut, but I don't know that absolutely for a fact. So I stress again, this is a good email in that it gives you an overall picture of what the Russians are saying and what is quite possibly, perhaps even probably, true. But I'm not confirming every single part of this, though the major advances undoubtedly are true. Now, there's also been reports of further Russian advances in other places. And before I proceed, I should say that the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, has now said that the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut is now close. The complete encirclement of these forces, which would make the situation in Bakhmut somewhat analogous to that of Mariupol way back in the spring and early summer. But anyway, that's what Pushilin said. But Pushilin has also talked about the situation in other places as well. And this is what Pushilin said this morning, Tuesday, about the situation on the near Vuhledar. He said the Vuhledar front is an important one. The enemy is trying to break through. At night, there were attempts to counterattack in the Pavlovka direction. Pavlovka is this village close to Vuhledar, which the Russians captured after a bitter fight about 2 weeks ago. There's been information that there's been much more fighting in and around Vuhledar since. Anyway, to continue with what Pushilin says, it was rather painful for the enemy, the loss of positions. However, we have a clear understanding of the necessity to achieve the goals set, and Vuhledar will very soon be liberated. Of course, he doesn't give a date, but he talks about it being very soon, which would suggest days perhaps rather than weeks, though, who knows. So that's what Pushilin said about Vuhledar. And as I've said, he's also said that Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces that are still in Bakhmut, are likely to be encircled very soon. Now, of course, Pushilin is not necessarily the most reliable commentator, and I will say that others, like Boris Rozhin, who is one of the more, shall we say, professional and reliable Russian commentators, he's put the situation rather differently. He also registers significant advances by the Russian forces all across Donbass. He acknowledges these big advances near Bakhmut, but he seems to take the view that the fall or capture of Bakhmut might still be some weeks off, and that he also says that the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut are not encircled and that they're still able and still receiving reinforcements, so that there is no actual Ukrainian pull out from Bakhmut. Now, that's the Russians. The Ukrainian military and Zelensky himself had nothing to say about the situation in Bakhmut yesterday. They were increasingly reticent about the situation. They have basically stopped speaking about Bakhmut for some time. But there are other reports, unconfirmed reports, that the commander of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny, has reported to Zelensky that the situation in Bakhmut of the Ukrainian forces there is becoming critical and is deteriorating by the day. So it does look as if things are going very badly for Ukraine in Bakhmut. We'll just have to wait and see how much longer this operation takes. But one thing I'm going to say further about this is this Western media reports have been, I think, trying to prepare the Western public for bad news from Bakhmut, and I've noticed that they've now taken to trying to deny that the fall of Bakhmut would be an important event. They are downplaying the significance of Bakhmut in strategic terms. Now, if that is true, then I do ask why the Ukrainians are defending themselves in Bakhmut, have been holding on, clinging on to Bakhmut with such incredible tenacity over the last 4 months, despite the very heavy casualties that they're experiencing there, as by the way the New York Times a short time ago acknowledged. But putting that aside, and the Ukrainians, as I've said, have in the past shown a willingness to sacrifice lives for strategic objectives or for to defend positions which I have not been able to understand, in all honesty. But putting all that aside, I've now seen various maps which on the contrary, do appear to confirm that far from being unimportant, Bakhmut is indeed central to Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. If Bakhmut does indeed fall, it puts the Russians in effect right in the center of Ukrainian defenses. It would be very much, perhaps on an even bigger scale, a repeat, or so it seems to me, of the Popasna affair way back in the spring and early summer. Popasnaya was this town in Lugansk region which the Russians captured after a difficult 2-month siege, not so very different from what we're seeing happen in Bakhmut. Once the Ukrainians lost Popasnaya, they were, again, the usual claims that this was a place of little strategic significance, that the Ukrainians had actually withdrawn to more defensible lines and all of that. But in reality, the loss of Popasnaya undermined the entire Ukrainian defense system in Lugansk region, and within a couple of weeks, the entirety of Lugansk region was in effect cleared of Ukrainian forces, and the important towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were lost. And it seems to me that Bakhmut is similar. The maps that I've seen, the sort of connections that lead out from Bakhmut, all point firmly in that direction. They strongly suggest that if Ukraine does indeed lose Bakhmut, then its position in Donetsk region becomes extremely difficult, very, very difficult to sustain. Perhaps the only place that bears some similar level of importance to Bakhmut in terms of the fighting in Donbass, in Donetsk region from a Ukrainian point of view, is the town of Avdifka near Donetsk. Now, if we just come back to the fighting in Donetsk, we're getting few reports at the moment about what's going on there. But again, reports such as they are talk of Russian advances. The Russians appear to be still in the process of clearing Marinka, one of these fortified towns that the Ukrainians established near Donetsk city. Marinka, by the way, has a population of around, or had before the war, a population of around 10,000 people. So that gives you some idea of its scale. I mean, it is significantly bigger than Persky, the fortified village that the Russians captured in August. But anyway, the Russians seem to be in the process of clearing Marinka. Marinka is connected by road to Vuhledar. Pushilin says that Vuhledar will be liberated very soon, whatever he means by that. And Avdifka, which is a little to the north of Marinka, and which, by the way, would be sandwiched between Marinka and Bakhmut, if Bakhmut and Marinka do indeed fall to the Russians, as now seems inevitable. Avdifka, which we had a pre-war population of around 30,000, in other words, it's a much bigger place than Marinka. Well, that, of course, is the center of Ukrainian defenses near Donetsk city. And I have to say, if Marinka falls and Bakhmut falls, it seems to me that Avdifka itself becomes untenable, undefendable, and we will probably see a collapse of Ukrainian defenses around Donetsk city as well. So it would be quite a big event if Bakhmut were indeed to fall. Moreover, if Bakhmut falls, it will enormously increase opportunities for the Russians to launch military strikes against Kramatorsk. Now, I understand that the headquarters of the Ukrainian army grouping in Donbass is actually located in Kramatorsk. So Kramatorsk will become, in effect, a frontline city. It's apparently not as defendable as Bakhmut is. And of course, if Kramatorsk is recaptured, it would be very similar to the events which took place in the summer rather, when Severodonetsk first fell and then Lysychansk fell soon after. If Kramatorsk falls, it's difficult to see how the northern spoke of the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk conurbation, Slavyansk, would be able to hold out for much longer. Slavyansk would also at that point fall. And by the way, the position of the Ukrainian forces in Liman, that place that they recaptured in early October, well, that would probably become untenable as well. And at that point, we would see the whole of Donbass presumably liberated. Now, we're moving ahead of ourselves. These events have not happened, but I do want to challenge head on this suggestion that Bakhmut is strategically of no significance. I'm not a military expert. I'm not somebody who understands lines on maps. I don't even read maps very well. But from what I can see with my inexpert knowledge, the importance of Bakhmut is obvious. It's obvious even to me. And that's why the fight for Bakhmut has been so intense over the last few weeks. No, over the last few months, rather. So that's where we are. I don't know how soon this is all going to work out, how much longer it's going to take for the Russians to crack Bakhmut, but all the indications are that that is what they intend to do. And I'm going to make one guess that Bakhmut, Abdifka, all of these places will indeed fall over the course of this winter. And that will then apparently open the way for a further Russian advance all the way to the east bank of the Dnieper, bringing the Russians opposite Dnipro, this big industrial city across, which would then be, the Russians would be across the Dnieper. They would be in a position to plant their artillery there, and they would be in a very good position at that point to start shelling Ukrainian positions in and around Dnipro, city which the Russians, by the way, still call Dnipropetrovsk. And at that point, I have to say, Ukraine's entire military position would become critical. I mean, it would be existentially dangerous for Ukraine. Now, whilst I am talking about all of these Russian advances, I should say that there was a rumor circulating yesterday, sourced, by the way, from some comments made by a Ukrainian official for Ukrenergo, Ukraine's energy company, that the Russians were preparing to quit the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Now, this has been much talked about. Alex Christoforou and I have just done a video about this topic, this very topic, for the Duran. It was a video we made before this latest rumor circulated. The Russians have categorically denied that they have any plan to withdraw from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and they repeated that denial today. Now, it's been pointed out that in the past the Russians have withdrawn from certain positions which they felt had become untenable. We saw that happen in eastern Kharkiv region in September. We saw that happen in Kherson region a few weeks ago. There is a difference, which is that in both of those two earlier withdrawals, the Russians did not make formal announcements ruling withdrawals out. On the contrary, if you go back and re-examine some of my videos in the run-up to the Russian withdrawal from Kherson region, I was talking at that time about how the Russians were not providing categorical denials that they were planning to withdraw from Kherson region, how they were on the contrary giving conflicting signals, and how that was creating a great deal of confusion. And in fact, as we now know, all of that was because they'd actually made a decision to withdraw from Kherson region. This time, the Russians are publishing categorical denials that they intend to withdraw from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So my own feeling is that this is fake news. I think it's been spread by the Ukrainians. They were also spreading stories, apparently, that there'd been explosions in Genichek. This is a town in Kherson region on the Sea of Azov, which the Russians have now made the capital of the area of Kherson region east of the Dnieper, which they control. And it seems that those stories were untrue as well. So we shouldn't believe everything we hear. The story about the Russian pullback from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant spread briefly across the Western media, but we've now had categorical denials from the Russians that this is the case, and I take those denials seriously, and I don't think there's any prospect of withdrawals from a withdrawal from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. I think that is not just a withdrawal too many, but I think that it would make little strategic sense for the Russians to undertake such a withdrawal now. So that, it seems to me, is the situation on the front lines. All across yesterday and early this morning, there were reports that the Russians are in the process of carrying out another major missile offensive against Ukraine. I'm not in a position to confirm this. These reports, which by the way seem to originate mainly from Ukraine, may or may not be true. I have no idea if a missile attack on the scale that's been suggested is going to take place over the next couple of hours or days. Obviously, I will discuss it when I have more news. But at the moment, I don't consider these reports confirmed, though another missile strike on Ukraine, on its energy system, seems to me only a matter of time now. Now, that's where we are. Situation on the battlefields now clearly turning against Ukraine in the front that matters, the key front that matters, the front in the Donbass. This is where Ukraine is now clearly losing, where the Russians are gaining ground, and where they seem to be on the verge of major breakthroughs in Vuhledar, in Marinka, and above all in Bakhmut, and perhaps heavy missile strikes on their way as well. What is the West doing? Well, they're looking, I have to say, extremely disorganized at the moment. Yesterday, on Monday, they were supposed to revisit the question of the oil price cap on Russian oil. Again, major arguments have taken place. The Poles are insisting that the price cap imposed on Russian oil should be $30 a barrel. Everyone else says it has to be much higher than this. The shipping powers, Greece, Malta, and Cyprus, want it to be as high as $70 in some instances, something which is outright rejected by the Poles and by the Baltic states. There was no agreement about that last week. There was another attempt to try and agree a price for the oil price cap on yesterday, on Monday. No agreement was reached. There are reports that there's growing exasperation with the Poles, great arguments with the Poles because of the rigid position supposedly that the Poles are taking. Apparently there's going to be further discussions about this at some point, but nobody apparently can agree as to when it will be that these discussions take place. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking because on the 5th of December, the ban on imports of Russian oil, which the European Union very unwisely decided to impose upon itself, ship imports, by the way, of shipborne Russian oil is due to take effect. And it is generally acknowledged that that is going to create rise in price for oil within the European Union, especially exacerbate what are already existing shortages for diesel oil, extremely important for commercial vehicles. And in general, some people were hoping that an agreement on a Russian oil price cap might be some kind of means, a sort of provide an opening to find ways perhaps to relax sanctions on the import of Russian oil. I'm not quite sure I understand how that's supposed to work, but that seems to me the situation that we're drifting towards. As of this moment in time, there is no agreement whether there will be an agreement, what kind of form that agreement will be. Well, that remains to be seen. Meanwhile, I have been reading with great interest in the Financial Times that European imports of Russian liquefied natural gas are now at a record high. And this is what the Financial Times has to say about this. Europe is importing a record amount of seaborne Russian gas, highlighting how the region has not completely shaken off its dependence on the country for the crucial fuel, even as flows through pipelines have all but stopped. Imports of Russian liquefied natural gas, which is typically transported on big tankers, rose more than 40% between January and October this year, compared with the same period in 2021, highlighting the difficulty for Europe in weaning itself off gas from Moscow, despite Brussels' attempts to shift away from Russian sources. And here's the actually key statistic. Russian LNG made up 16% of European seaborne imports during the period, while the total volume of 17.8 billion cubic meters represented a fraction of the 62.1 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas flows during this time. It nevertheless leaves Europe exposed to Vladimir Putin's weaponization of energy. One day, Putin could wake up and say, we'll stop sending LNG to Europe, forcing the region to buy from an even more expensive spot market, said Anne-Sophie Corbeau, global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Russia could also divert the cargoes to LNG-starved countries such as Bangladesh and Pakistan at cheap prices to achieve political gains and put pressure on Europeans, she added. It's very important not to forget that a lot of countries are suffering because they cannot afford LNG. There are no sanctions on Russian gas owing to its importance to some European nations' energy security. The Kremlin has taken advantage by gradually reducing the flow through pipelines after the invasion of Ukraine, boosting prices and fueling a cost of living across the continent. Well, the last is deeply controversial, to put it mildly. And anyway, returning to this whole topic, in order to fill the gap, Europe, which last year, that's 2021, imported 155 billion cubic meters of Russian natural gas, including LNG, has turned to the international LNG market. It imported a record 111 billion cubic meters worth of LNG globally between January and October, an increase of nearly 70% year on year. And that we now discover a significant proportion of that rise in LNG imports into Europe. And in fact, what we now discover is that a significant proportion of the LNG that Europe has been importing in order to replace the Russian pipeline gas it is no longer importing is in fact Russian LNG. And of course we don't know for a fact how much longer this trade in Russian LNG will continue, because I have no doubt at all that the Russians will indeed at some point seek other customers for their LNG. So in terms of energy, in terms of imports of energy products, it's starting to look as if the Europeans are in an even worse shape than I'd anticipated. It turns out that though they have largely stopped imports of pipeline gas from Russia, they've to some extent compensated by increasing imports of LNG gas from Russia. It's not obviously the bulk of the LNG that they've been importing, but it is a significant part of that LNG which they have been importing. And it's quite likely, it seems to me, that it is that Russian LNG that has made the difference between whether or not the Europeans will be able to get through this winter or not. Anyway, there we go. So LNG, growing difficulties coming in the future, gas altogether, growing difficulties coming in the future. No clear sign that the Europeans have any real solutions to this. Arguments amongst the Europeans about oil price caps, no real indication that they have any clear way forward to dealing with this problem of oil price caps. Growing arguments between the Europeans and the Americans. The Europeans increasingly feeling that the Americans have taken them for a ride, that the United States is benefiting from the economic war of attrition, the sanctions war, and that Europe is paying all the cost, and that the burden is being shared unequally, and that the Americans have in fact taken advantage of the Europeans. And we are starting to see growing signs of acrimony between the Europeans and the Americans on this topic. And growing signs also that the Americans, and for their part, are continuing to put more pressure on the Europeans over various issues. So again, reading in the Financial Times, and indeed in other British newspapers this morning, I was reading about how the Americans are now piling on the pressure on the Europeans to reduce their economic trade with their trading relations with China. And I'm going to come back to China briefly in the end of this program, but we can see how the Americans are now clearly intent on imposing bloc discipline on the Europeans over the Ukraine crisis, over China, and the growing problems that this is causing in Europe, and the confusion and uncertainty that there is in Europe about how to respond to this, with the anti-Russian, anti-Chinese, pro-US hardliners like the Poles and the Baltic states, and the Green Party in Germany pulling in one direction and the others pulling in the other direction, and increasing quarrels and arguments and disputes taking place as well. And meantime, they also have to face this gathering crisis in Ukraine itself. There's now widespread understanding that the situation in Ukraine is going horribly wrong, that the Russian missile attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure are taking a terrifying toll. And before long, we're no doubt going to start to see concerns about Russian military gains in Ukraine. The narrative that Ukraine is winning the war is going to become increasingly difficult to sustain. And there doesn't seem to be a very clear idea about what to do, because we've now had reports, including in the American media, that many European countries have now exhausted the weapon stocks that they can supply to Ukraine. And there was one very interesting story that's been doing the rounds, and which I think perhaps illustrates rather well the growing problems. because the Boeing Corporation has apparently made a suggestion to the US government that as a cheap way of finding an effective weapons to send to Ukraine, a aerial glide bomb should be mated with a jet engine. And apparently there's quite a lot of these bombs and quite a lot of these jet engines. So combining them together will produce at reasonable cost an effective small caliber munition which can be supplied to Ukraine from some point in the spring of 2023. Now, I have to say that this may be true, but it does, at least to me, rather support the point that Brian Beletic has been making at the New Atlas about how the United States and the Western powers are starting to run out of HIMARS missiles, rocket-powered missiles that they can send to Ukraine. Because though these small caliber bombs with a jet engine would have twice the range of the HIMARS missiles that have been supplied to Ukraine, they seem to me to be in all other respects inferior to those HIMARS missiles. And this looks to me, and I am to some extent speculating here, but it looks to me as if this is a bodge which has been put together in a hurry to come up with a solution to the HIMARS, the pending HIMARS missile shortage. In other words, to provide Ukraine with something that might, to some extent, substitute for the HIMARS missiles, even though it would be a small caliber bomb, one I suspect easier to intercept and jam, and it might not be, to be straightforward about it, as effective as the original HIMARS missile has been. So a good example, perhaps, of the problems the West is now steadily experiencing in terms of supply of weapon systems to Ukraine. And in fact, we're now perhaps seeing the pressure to escalate grow. And there's a report in Bloomberg that once again, ideas of supplying Ukraine with fighter jets, F-16s, Patriot missiles, those kind of heavy weapons, that these have all been floated again, except of course that there were very, very good reasons, very good political reasons and strategic reasons why these sort of weapons were not supplied to Ukraine before. And if under the pressure of these events, these weapons are going to be supplied, which will take a very long time to happen, by the way. Well, if they are indeed supplied, then it reverses a policy which the United States and the Western powers had sworn that they would stick to, and is a sign of how, with every Russian escalation, the Western powers are having to run and escalate in turn, only they can never catch up, ultimately, with what the Russians are going to do in Ukraine, because Russia has the geographical advantage and the industrial advantage and possesses in Ukraine what Barack Obama back in 2016 said was escalation dominance. So, complicated and difficult situation that the Western powers have found themselves in, and I do wonder whether, in fact, escalating in this kind of way is drawing the West into a confrontation, a greater confrontation than they had anticipated, greater confrontation with the Russians than they had anticipated, one that they swore to themselves that they would never find themselves in. And of course, what is happening is proof that they are in effect losing control of this conflict. Now, that brings me on to the topic of China, because of course the United States has been pushing the Europeans to cut their economic links with China. They have support from their friends. The German Foreign Ministry, controlled now by the Green Party, has published a report, or has made a report, which also talks about the need for cutting connections with China. A fact which, as we saw as a result of his trip to Beijing, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, doesn't in his heart really support, and which of course would horrify German business. And very much as in Moscow, with the many reports about President Putin's government being in a supposedly increasingly brittle position, about regime change in Moscow coming, we saw over the last couple of hours and days similar reports about Xi Jinping's position in China. There are a small number, from what I could tell, rather small protests about the lockdowns. I've made it clear my own view about this, that China's lockdown policy has become increasingly irrational, that it is impossible for China to insulate itself from the presence of this infection, and that doing so is becoming increasingly self-defeating. It's unsurprising that there are people in China that are complaining about this, but these complaints, these protests, are not going to shake the Chinese government or even dent it. And interestingly, even as these protests were taking place, the Western media almost entirely ignored the collapse of support for the pro-US, pro-independence DPP party, the ruling party in Taiwan, in the local elections which have just taken place there, something which undoubtedly the Politburo in Beijing is more interested in than these scattered protests, minor protests that have taken place across the country. But one can see why those protests in China have attracted all that attention, because ultimately the only solution to the gathering problems that the West is facing is some kind of regime change, either in Moscow or Beijing, or preferably both. The only way Ukraine could hope to achieve victory is if there was a political crisis in Moscow. The only way that the Western powers could probably achieve their ultimate objectives with China, or at least the objectives the neocons have with China, is through regime change in China. And so we see how they seize on every little indication, the fact that Putin's rating has dropped by 1%, 1.5%, from 80% to 78.5% in one or two opinion polls, even though it's crept up again. The fact that there's a few scattered protests in Shanghai and Beijing, that kind of thing, people seize on it in the hope that this is going to bring about that long hoped for change, this sudden magical resolution of the problems that the West is seeing accumulate around it. I don't think either of these eventualities, regime change in Moscow or regime change in Beijing, are going to happen. More to the point, I don't think it's appropriate for leaders in the West to gamble on these possibilities. I think what we desperately need, certainly with the Russians, is negotiations. And it's an alarming sign that talks about nuclear weapons, arms control in effect, have apparently been postponed, with the Russians apparently concluding that there is little point in proceeding with these negotiations with the United States at the present time. So, what the Russians are clearly indicating is that there has to be a proper resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm sure that as far as the Chinese are concerned, in order to really establish trust between China and the West, there has to be some kind of resolution of the crisis, the festering crisis over Taiwan. Unfortunately, and I've talked about this so many times, the West is not prepared to go there. So we're going to get more quarrels, more disputes, more bad ideas like the oil price cap, more quarrels about oil, about gas, about trade relationships, imbalances between the US and the Europeans, more bitter statements and comments about what the way forward is. And I can't help but think that these quarrels, these arguments, these recriminations take us nowhere at all, even as the clouds thicken and darken. Well, I've made these points many times in many videos. I suppose some of you are probably tired of hearing them by now, but I do feel that they need to continue to be said. We'll see what happens. It does look as if big events are coming in the Donbass. I will try and stay on top of them, and obviously there'll be more videos from me. In the meantime, please remember, you can find all my videos, all the Duran's videos, on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there. Our hats, our hoodies, our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check the your subscription to this channel. Be more from me soon as events develop. And thank you for joining me again. And I look forward to speaking to you in my next video very soon.